grams of potassium. So there are actually solutions available on a local level that can be implemented if you break through the taboos first. And I thought that's another interesting point. And then my final point is, at World Water Week last week in Stockholm, Malin Falkenmark talked about how there is sufficient water use, there is sufficient water available globally right now and in 2050 to produce the amount of food we need based on a 5% animal protein diet, the rest protein from other areas. However, one interesting point right now is that 42% of the recorded sea level rise, that extra water is coming directly from groundwater sources and aquifers. So actually, water has to be one of the main things you can think about when you talk about food security.
Thank you, and thanks for reminding us too. The points of intervention are actually, I think, really important. I think reflecting both on what Ibrahim just said and what you just said in terms of what you're actually trying to fix, and how far you take that intervention is really important. Any other responses on Andrea?
Yeah. Good question about the avocado farming and what it gives to the farmers. What it does give is power to access, or to, well, it gives them capital to access then machinery, skilled labor, unskilled labor, processing facilities, production, the tools of production to increase their productivity in other parts of their farm, because avocado production is avocados, you grow them on farm with other products. So in fact they're producing food for their families and food for the local market, as well as the avocados side by side. And that kind of co-cropping is what we're seeing emerge in smallholding. It's part of what the model that was in the context of the RED project as well. So actually not relying on a single product, but relying on a diversity. And some of them can be cash crops, don't have to be, but cash crops do provide then the capital needed for the investment in increasing the productivity of the rest of the land. And that's important. And then the question about keeping farmers on the land, and perhaps this goes back to Ibrahim's point in terms of self-choice, really self-determination. I think that's important to give people the option for self-determination if they want to stay on land and produce, and that's for them to choose to do, but giving options in terms of that production so that it can be sustainable, so that it can be a fulfilling life and livelihood for them, and enabling that to happen is part of what needs to happen.
Dominic?
So I appreciate the systems approach that all the speakers have taken this morning. My name is Dominic. I work in leadership development for sustainability professionals, and I'm on the CEC steering committee with several in this room. That systems approach allows us to talk about both supply and demand in terms of food security. And in the spirit of Andrea's wanting to have uncomfortable conversations in this conservation setting, I wonder if we could talk briefly about the demand side in this question. Demand, the assumption it seems behind this idea that we have to double food production over the next 50 years is a supply focus. There's an assumption around population growth and about how much we're consuming per capita. And Matthew gave us some insight into, okay, perhaps that consumption is based on a 5% protein, 5% of protein coming from meat diet. I wonder if we could explore that a little bit further, looking at low resource intensity diets. When I think, Ibrahim, of the point you made about 43% of cereals being eaten, and then the inefficiencies around feeding those cereals to livestock and then consuming the livestock. My understanding is that you can feed 40 people grain, the cereals, or one person the meat. That's staggering, right? And yet diet is such a personal choice. So I think my question is, how do you have that conversation with people about diet? It's personal, it's cultural, it's a tough one to have. So how do you start those conversations?
Julie?
I'll just start that with saying that in the groups that I work with, they've deliberately chosen to take that topic off the table, knowing that it's important, but it's also one of the intractables, at least from the perspective of who is at that table and what they can work on. And so the work they're doing and looking at efficiencies and measurement doesn't speak to that. I would say that, as we look at sustainability, it does include everything from the environmental to the social and economic, and social includes the personal choices that you're speaking to. And so there probably are groups beyond the ones that I work with that are better positioned to work with it. But it's kind of a non-answer. But again, I would say that it's there is the reality, there is the projections that this group works within to try to do the best it can to understand how you meet that goal. And if those projections shift, then I think we can shift the approach.
And inevitably they will shift in one direction or another. That's Dominic. I think your point also gets to an interesting point of intervention as well, just based on this. Collaborative efforts in groups and policies can only take us so far, and a lot of this then comes down to that individual point of intervention, and that starts to look at a whole different set of strategies and information that I think we haven't touched on a whole lot here today, but is equally important, as you said. Just looking at the food waste issue, one that I'm personally intrigued with in the United States, and this is class independent, so regardless of where we have food insecure in the United States, regardless of where you sit on that spectrum. Most of the food that gets thrown away at home. Companies can't fix that. Governments can't fix that. Only we as individuals can start to fix that. So, there are some really interesting conversations, I think, to be had about social behavior.
I just want to mention briefly how we try to engage in that conversation, because it is a complicated conversation as a company. It's also something that it's hard to have a conversation about people's diets, particularly when we're not a retail company. But what we did do was to engage with students. And it actually started about food waste. It's something called the TFF challenge, the Thought for Food challenge. Check it out, it's online. It started actually in Europe 2 years ago, where we put out a challenge to students to start thinking about food waste and how they can change and manage that in their own life. And they got a number of challenges. First, to come up with an idea on how to reduce it in an area that they can impact directly, how they can scale it up within their direct community, if it's their university or their village or town where they live, and how they could actually get other people on board to make this bigger. And of course there was a prize involved. They got to go to the One Young World, is the WEF of the youth, so to say. And it was quite amazing what kind of discussion that triggered. We never thought it would be so big. And we never thought that they would go beyond looking into their refrigerators and figuring out what they should do with the food that they had at home. They started actually thinking about up the system, up the value chain, and started discussing many of these things, like what kind of calories do we need, how should they be distributed, what is actually going into this, what post-harvest, how does that affect the whole food chain. This year we took it global, so now there's universities from all over the world being part of this, and it's still an ongoing community, and they've become very strong ambassadors in this topic. And I want to mention that it's sponsored by Syngenta, but we by no way influence the way the conversations are going. It has been a very critical conversation. It's actually interesting to see how eager these people are to get involved and have a conversation with people all over the world on these topics that actually make a lot of difference. It's important for them. So I think there's huge interest among the young people to discuss this and understand this better and what they can actually impact themselves. So if you're interested, I can just recommend to go and have a look on all the great stuff that they're posting online. They have Facebook
groups, and this is beyond me. I'm born before the social kind of generation. I'm hardwired the old way, as they say. I'm not hardwired like the people who are under 25. But they are really making use of all of these new technologies to share information across the globe about this topic. So I think this is a conversation that is up and coming. And people are becoming much more aware, and young people are really looking into this. So hopefully we soon can talk about it without being such an obstacle.
Right, I'm going to give Ibrahim the last comment, and we have a moment left. We'll go back to the gentleman from Pakistan.
I just wanted to comment on self-sufficiency. I think Machu is the one that raised it. I would argue that we should look at the issue from the food security point of view and not from the self-sufficiency point of view. Because it may be, this is maybe based on my personal experience. In many parts of the world, governments have developed policies to have self-sufficiency at the national level, which has been a disaster. Because not everywhere you can produce what you want to consume. At some point in time, you have to make a choice and look at the comparative advantages, especially the ecological comparative advantages, that you can produce certain things in your land, but you cannot necessarily produce what you want to eat. Okay? And that sort of obstination to produce what you want to eat in your land has led to ecological disasters. Okay? And you should produce what nature has allowed you to produce, eventually sell it, and buy food that you cannot produce. But that obstination of fighting against nature to produce what you would like to consume has led to disasters. So I have that and I can go into more details because I have seen many examples, including actually in the Middle East. There are areas where you cannot produce what you want to consume, full stop. About the personal choice, that was Dominic. I wish everybody has had the choice to eat what they want to eat. Unfortunately, that's not true for everybody. There are many parts of the world where you have no choice but to buy, but not to be given, to buy food that has now been your diet, but was not necessarily the diet that you had wanted to have. Again, it has to do with policies, bad policies sometimes imposed by governments. It had to do with investments that were made at a point in time where you had no choice. Take the example of Africa. Why the Green Revolution did not work in Africa? Essentially, especially, I'm talking now more based on my personal experience again. Most of the investments were made at that time by people who had no interest but to produce something for export. Okay? They were not producing for the local needs, they were producing because they needed that product out there. And they invested, and the system basically has been established with trade penetrations that are very difficult to disentangle. So you end up producing cocoa, not because you want to produce cocoa, but because that is what you found there as a system. And it is very difficult to change that, as you know. So unfortunately, the new authorities have not really developed time to think about how to transform that in a progressive way. Or maybe they don't have time. Maybe they use their brains more to fight each other than to actually fight for their development. But this is the situation. So unfortunately, you don't necessarily consume what you want. This is how many people in Africa ended up eating rice. But rice was not the first product, and not the national product. They actually eat rice from Asia, thanks to the Green Revolution. Not because they actually wanted to eat rice, but because that is what was in the market. Again, imported by the same people who were producing cocoa and importing rice from their colonies from elsewhere. And you create a diet that is now established and very difficult to change.
Thank you. One last question, and then we'll conclude.
Just
or
one
comment.
regarding using the wastewater to produce food, and one should use very cautiously, because the sewage wastewater, municipal wastewater, can be used to produce vegetable, and it is being used in Asian country. But if there is some industrial waste is mixed, then there is a problem of heavy metals in the vegetables, and it can lead to the failure of kidneys. And there are some contamination problem as well, E. coli contamination and blood contamination. So it must be treated first, and then it can be used for the production of vegetable. And big cities are already practicing this sort of activities. The second, food security and food self-sufficiency are quite different things. I mean, a nation could be self-sufficient in food, but the people cannot be food. They don't have food security probably. The food security, I mean, the food is available to everyone of their own choice to perform daily activities, or they can buy it. So if it is not produced, he has enough money to buy it. So that is the food security. Food self-sufficient, nation is the food self-sufficient, but maybe the people may not be food security. So security is more important than food self-sufficiency. Thank you.
More to discuss going forward. We're past time, so we're 10 minutes past time, so I am going to conclude, but I know there's going to be further conversation about this particular topic, and I think there's, I think we'll have the opportunity for those of you who can stay to continue that conversation, but I do want to give those of you who need to go out to other sessions and other meetings the chance to do so at this point. Thank you all for coming to this session, and thank you to our panelists for and we look forward to, what I have learned from this is there is a continued need for dialogue and participation and discourse, and to have those uncomfortable conversations, as Andrea said, to continue to move these things forward in a way that's going to be productive and constructive and not destructive in the long run. So thank you all very much.
Good job, sir.
I read your article.